In February 1916, the German army launched an offensive against the French fortress city of Verdun that would become one of the most horrifying battles in human history. By the time it ended 10 months later, more than 700,000 men had been killed, wounded, or simply erased by artillery fire so intense that entire sections of the battlefield no longer looked like Earth at all. But what made Verdun truly terrifying was not just the scale of death. It was the idea behind it. Because Verdun was not supposed to be a breakthrough. It was supposed to be a machine designed to bleed France white. By 1916, Europe had already spent nearly 2 years trapped in industrialized trench warfare. The massive offensives of 1914 and 1915 had failed again and again. Machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire had turned movement into slaughter, while entire armies disappeared, trying to cross open ground that defenders could now destroy with industrial efficiency. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed he understood the problem better than anyone else. Germany, he argued, did not need to conquer all of France. It only needed to destroy the French army itself, and to do that, Falkenhayn believed he needed to attack somewhere the French could not politically afford to lose. That place was Verdun. Verdun was more than just a fortress system. For centuries, it had been one of the symbolic gateways into France itself. French politicians and generals viewed it almost as sacred ground, surrounded by massive forts, underground bunkers, artillery positions, and defensive lines built over decades. Falkenhayn believed the French would defend Verdun no matter how catastrophic the losses became. And that meant Germany could turn the battlefield into a war of attrition unlike anything Europe had ever seen before. His goal was chillingly simple: not to take Verdun quickly, to force France to keep feeding men into a battle that would destroy them. The attack began on February 21st, 1916. And almost immediately, Verdun descended into hell. More than 1,000 German artillery pieces opened fire across the French lines. Millions of shells followed over the coming days. Entire forests disappeared. Villages ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed into the earth while men inside them were buried alive before they even saw the enemy. French survivors described the ground physically shaking beneath them for hours at a time. One soldier later wrote that the bombardment felt less like combat and more like the end of the world. And then the Germans advanced. Specialized German storm units moved behind flamethrowers, grenades, and light machine guns, infiltrating shattered French defenses that no longer resembled organized front lines. Entire units disappeared in smoke, debris, and confusion so dense that soldiers often had no idea where their own lines even were anymore. Communication collapsed almost immediately. Telephone wires were shredded by shell fire. Messengers vanished crossing open ground. Officers lost contact with neighboring units. Entire sections of Verdun became isolated pockets of men trying to survive bombardments strong enough to erase roads, trenches, landmarks, and sometimes entire hillsides. And in the middle of that chaos stood Fort Douaumont. Douaumont was supposed to be one of the strongest fortresses in Europe. Instead, in one of the greatest humiliations of the war, German troops captured it almost by accident. French commanders, believing massive forts had become obsolete against modern artillery, had stripped much of Douaumont's defenses and reduced its garrison. When German assault troops reached the fort on February 25th, only a tiny French force remained inside. A handful of German soldiers entered through exposed sections of the fort and captured the entire structure with astonishing ease. For France, the psychological shock was enormous, because Verdun was supposed to hold, and yet the battle only grew worse. The deeper both sides poured men into Verdun, the more impossible the battlefield became. Artillery never stopped. Shells landed day and night for months. Soldiers described bodies hanging from trees, half-buried corpses dissolving into mud, and entire trenches filled with human remains that could no longer be removed because the shelling was too intense. At times, the dead became part of the battlefield itself. Men slept beside corpses, ate beside corpses, fought on top of corpses, and still the reinforcements kept coming. For France, Verdun became a symbol of national survival. General Philippe Pétain reorganized the defense around the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Road, a supply route that became one of the most important logistical lifelines of the war. Thousands of trucks moved continuously toward Verdun, carrying ammunition, food, artillery, and replacement soldiers, while damaged vehicles were shoved aside to keep traffic moving at all costs. At times, a truck reportedly reached Verdun every few seconds. Because if the road failed, Verdun failed. And if Verdun failed, France feared the psychological consequences could destroy the army itself. French units rotated through Verdun so frequently that eventually nearly 3/4 of the entire French army served there at some point during the battle, which meant almost every French family in the country became connected to Verdun in one way or another. Inside the forts, conditions became nightmarish. Fort Vaux in particular turned into a nightmare of underground combat. Soldiers fought through dark corridors filled with smoke, dust, blood, and toxic air, while artillery pounded the structure from above. Water supplies collapsed. Wounded men lay trapped underground for days. French defenders reportedly drank condensation from walls and filthy water from shell-damaged containers, while bodies decomposed around them in the darkness. Flamethrowers filled corridors with fire. Grenades exploded in enclosed rooms. Machine guns fired through underground passageways where the sound alone could deafen nearby soldiers. At one point, carrier pigeons became the only remaining way for trapped French defenders to communicate with the outside world after every other connection failed. And still the fighting continued. The psychological damage became enormous. Verdun created a battlefield where soldiers often died without ever seeing the enemy directly. Artillery caused the overwhelming majority of casualties. Men disappeared beneath explosions powerful enough to erase bodies completely. Others survived physically, but suffered mental collapse after weeks spent under constant bombardment without proper sleep, food, or relief. Some soldiers stopped reacting entirely. Others broke down screaming during shellfire. Many simply vanished into the mud and debris of Verdun itself. And then there was the smell. Burning explosives, rotting bodies, mud, smoke, human waste, poison gas. One French soldier later described Verdun as a furnace where the battlefield itself seemed alive. And in many ways, it was. Because the landscape no longer behaved like normal terrain. After months of bombardment, entire sections of Verdun had been transformed into crater fields, so shattered that soldiers struggled to move even short distances. Rain turned the ground into mud thick enough to trap wounded men alive. Artillery churned earth, bones, shattered trees, and bodies together into something survivors barely recognized as a battlefield anymore. Verdun stopped looking like France. It started looking like another planet. And yet neither side could stop. Because by that point, the battle had become larger than strategy, larger than terrain, larger even than Verdun itself. It had become a symbol. French troops rotated endlessly through the battlefield, while German commanders continued pouring men into offensives that increasingly failed to achieve breakthroughs. Every attack captured ground measured in meters, while costing thousands of lives. Entire forests vanished from maps. Villages disappeared permanently. Forts changed hands again and again, while artillery erased the ground around them so completely that soldiers sometimes struggled to identify where roads, trenches, or even hills had once existed. And still the shelling continued. By the end of 1916, Verdun had become one of the longest and most devastating battles in modern history. France survived, but the cost was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, entire generations destroyed. And perhaps most horrifying of all, Verdun demonstrated something the world had never fully understood before 1916. Industrial warfare no longer needed dramatic breakthroughs to annihilate human beings. It could simply trap armies inside a landscape of mud, artillery, exhaustion, and fear, and keep feeding men into it until almost nothing remained. And long after the battle ended, Verdun kept killing people anyway. Unexploded shells still poisoned the ground. Human remains continued surfacing in forests and fields decades later, because Verdun was never really rebuilt. The battlefield was simply abandoned where it died.